You're watching convention coverage on site.
TV show that no one watched. I didn't watch it. And yeah, so it just didn't grab me, my TV show. I mean, technically it was a TV show based on something I created, and they didn't let me write it. And at first I was excited because they did this. It was a French company did it, and I couldn't understand it, and I thought it was great. Then they translated it to English. It didn't work so well for me anymore. So I recommend the French version of it. So unless you speak French, then probably no. What brings all of you? What's that?
But what was it called?
Oh, right. I should lead with that. It was called Scary Larry, and it was based on a comic book I did in 2000 called Little Gloomy, which I have a copy of to hold up. Unless your vision is impaired, you should be able to see. This became it was a comic about a young girl living in a town full of monsters. And when the studios got a hold of it, they said, we can't have a female lead. That was not great. So they changed it to a male lead and kind of broke the whole thing, and I didn't watch it. So that wasn't great.
It's a great endorsement for a show.
Yeah, when the creators
Didn't watch it.
they broke it and I never watched it. So, but I kept the comic rights, so I'm all right.
Start with story panels, or do you just go with an overarching storyline and then break it into panels for later editing?
Depends on the book and who I'm working with. But I usually do a plot first, especially if it's for a company like DC. You pitch the plot, and then I do page 1, panel 1, and I do panel breakdowns, but I might then write a whole bunch of dialogue and just move it around and figure out where it works. Sometimes you work with an artist who wants to work more the Marvel method, if anyone's familiar with the Marvel method of writing.
I'm a little familiar with that. Is that where you write the dialogue first and then you do everything afterwards?
The opposite. You write a plot, the artist takes that and turns it into a comic, and then you go through and go, yes, I'll have them say this here. It really makes it easy to do in comparison. I like that method. I don't have to do much. I have a video game I like to play while all the work is being done by other people. It's fun. But usually I do the full script method, which is page 1, panel 1, and you're getting a full description, camera angle, the expression on the face, they're holding a tiny glass, anything like that, and then dialogue. So.
Would you say the creative freedom when you're making a story and using certain characters has changed over time for the better or
Okay, it's always depended on the project, but yes, it has changed. Yes, I would say for the worst on certain projects. When people were less invested, when I started in this industry was 1991, 92, and a lot less people in pop culture were invested in this material. I would go to San Diego Comic-Con, and yes, it was a huge show with 30,000 people, but you go now, it's sold out in capacity within an hour at 150,000. So the more pressure is on this, more people, more eyes on it, means the editorial process and the companies get more picky about what you do. So I was working on Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, 2012, and I literally had 7 different people making notes on every script I did, sometimes arguing in their notes with each other about what I should be changing or doing. I'm like, I don't even know.
I do more stuff on my own now, so I don't really have to worry about that. But when I do freelance stuff, when I don't own the character, I don't own the property, I'm just a hired gun. I can input my ideas, but really the stuff that I have control over is the image itself and how I decide just the smallest things like composition, color, lighting. But then they'll sometimes come in. I've done some stuff for Dark Horse and stuff for Valiant lately. And then a couple of things in between, I did a thing for Marvel a couple years ago. It just depends on the editorial group because Valiant has a committee that looks at everything. And so everyone gets to put input into it, which, to be honest, drives me up the wall because it's too much. But that's so normal now. You know,
Yeah.
especially if you start dealing with an IP that isn't yours, so much input. And one thing I joke with other artists when we get assigned to do a cover for something, they usually want to see like Dark Horse doesn't usually ask me to send them like 3 examples of a pencil sketch before I go to a cover, but I'll send them 1 or 2 because I like those guys. Valiant will see as many as you can do for them. And then they go through and they pick. So the trick is to show them as few as possible because they will almost always pick the one you don't want to do. It's the big joke with a lot of artists. It's like, here were the 3 I sent them. They picked the one I hate.
Yeah.
So we just say, don't show them what you don't like. Then you won't have to do it.
Something you were saying about the
I don't know if that
how it's
answers the
become
question even remotely, but
increasingly committee-like. I was talking about how when I was working on Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, I had notes from 7 different people from Nickelodeon, like all weighing in and arguing with each other in the notes on some cases.
yeah,
And,
I've had that.
I found that you get a lot of people that look at the work, they have a need, and I can't blame them here, but to justify their job.
Yeah,
If they don't find something wrong.
I call it muscle flexing sometimes.
That's a good way. If they're not finding something wrong, they're worried somebody's going to look like, especially if something gets through, they're like, well, what notes did you give? Well, I gave all, they need to be able to show that they did something.
And they want to be the smartest notes and
Yeah.
the most whatever.
Oh,
Yeah,
God.
I had a script
Yeah.
for sometimes what happens when we get up here and we tell stories, we want to really dish and tell you stuff that you might not hear anyplace else. So I have to really watch it because I want to say names. I don't care. I'll never work with them again. But there's one editor who I've known not an editor, a publisher. I've known him since before he started his own comic book company. I've known him for years. And he's got a small editorial staff that I don't think they care about my work, but he and I were friends. So he hired me to write a script for one of their characters, which is a licensed character that everybody knows, who has red hair and carries a sword, and is a female. Oh, is that too much information? Okay, so I wrote a story, and got some notes, which I responded to, and then the book happened, and it came out, and they liked it, and it did well, actually, and they asked me to do another one. And then they asked me to pitch some other thing, too. I can't remember what it was I pitched, but I wrote this script. Actually, I think it wasn't a Red Sonja thing. It was some other thing that they asked me to do. And I was actually kind of excited about writing it and doing the covers for it. And so I got the notes back on my marked up outline, and there were 3 different people who had given their notes. And I actually hadn't seen this before. I hadn't actually seen other people's markups on my stuff come back to me. And I don't know if they knew that I was supposed to see it. But one person had taken some passage of what I'd written, and trust me, they had misunderstood it. They hadn't read it right. And they didn't like it. And they said, this was the quote, "The way Dan has it here is dumb because ... And I was like, I had to read that a couple of times ago. The way I have it is dumb because... And I went through and I go, oh, crap, what did I do? And I looked through, I go, no, they read it wrong. And so I responded, and I don't know who wrote that. It could have been the publisher. I have no idea.
Yeah.
And I have no idea if they wanted me to see it or not. But it was so low rent that I really never wanted to work with them again. I was so glad when they didn't do it.
Well, it's like going back to the Turtles thing. I had a former DC editor who was now working at Nickelodeon, looked at, gave me these notes, just deconstructing what I had written, saying the character would never do this. They would never do this. You've got it all wrong. They'd never do this. And I had to write back the simple thing of this is actually a scene from the cartoon that I'm writing this based on. This is a flashback.
I didn't write it.
To an episode that you're saying the character would never do a thing from. It's from the first episode. Have you watched it?
Ben Grimm would never say it's clobbering time.
Oh.
Get rid of that.
Yeah, it's a lot of that sometimes.
What's this flame on Johnny stuff?
And so
Yeah.
it makes the process a lot harder, which is one of the things that's nice about doing your own stuff.
Yeah, I was going to say that sort of feeds into the whole topic, which is when you get a chance to do your own stuff. And what's funny is that one of the first things I did in comics, I think it was the second thing I did in comics, was called The Psycho. And it was I got hooked up with this writer, James Hudnall, who'd written, which is kind of interesting because at the time it came out in 89 or 90. It was called The Unauthorized Biography of Lex Luthor. And it was this one shot.
Oh, yeah.
And what it was it took the idea of Lex Luthor's unauthorized biography as kind of a joke on the art of the deal.
Yeah.
And
Even mimicked the cover.
even the
Yeah.
cover mimicked the cover. And this is Hudnall, who became an arch conservative later.
Oh, wow.
But
I didn't
in the
realize
story, Lex Luthor is very controlling, and he's kind of a demagogue, and he's, he thinks he's smarter than everybody else. Like Lex Luthor stuff, we already know about. And so they said, yeah, he's got this thing he wants to do, and you would own it with him. It would be a creator-owned thing. You guys would own it, and because of that, we would have more creative control. And so I ended up doing this book, and I created the looks of all these characters and all these costumes, and just it was a free-for-all. I just got to do whatever I wanted, basically, and Jim went along with most of it. And we had almost no editorial input on the story, the character design. The editor was like, it's your thing, go. Mike Carlin, the Superman editor.
Yeah.
And it was like, this is the second time I had done something in comics. And I couldn't believe it. It was like, this is comics? This is amazing. So when I finally got around to doing some job that was like a preset of character later on, there would sometimes be things where they come in and say, you can't do that. But it really wasn't for like 10 years because DC was very, very hands-off. And what I found is if you were doing a story that was out of their monthly continuity, they kind of didn't care. You could do whatever you want. It was like Elseworlds. Everything was in Elseworlds practically. But if you were doing a monthly book where it had to fit into the continuity of all these other titles, then they would really get into the minutia. And I was just glad I wasn't doing that,
I did a book, Supergirl Cosmic Adventures in the 8th grade. And there's a lot of elements of that you see like got picked up later and are put into something like the Supergirl show that recently ended, some things like that. But at the time when I did it, it was the all ages section of the book. They literally did not care. I got to reinvent the character from the ground up and do my own version. And if they ever brought me back to do a sequel, I know that I would suddenly be facing all these restrictions on things I created.
Yeah, they have to take notice.
Yeah, I remember Peter David, who wrote The Hulk for years, got that job. I remember him writing in an article. He got that job because no one wanted the Hulk. The Hulk was a dead property.
Can't even imagine.
Toxic. No one enjoyed it. The book didn't sell. That's how he broke into comics. Because no one wanted it. He worked in the shipping department.
Yeah.
So he gets this job writing the Hulk, and it blows up because they let him do whatever he wants. So all of a sudden he had all these rules.
Yeah.
And the book started.
That's always been I always maintain that, like with editors that can get. What happens is sometimes you'll get an editor who's a frustrated writer, and they really feel like they have what it takes to do the job that you're doing, or if you're a writer, in my case I would do both. But so they will be very persnickety, they'll be hyper attentive, and they can also be a little bit condescending. And there was one editor at DC Comics who was all those things, and I had to deal with him for a couple of years. And I had to just sort of look at it as I'm learning how to get along with this personality so I can keep working in the comics. It was like someone said, why do you work with that guy? Just tell them you don't want to work with him. Tell me it's impossible. I go, no, because if I can learn to work with him, I've got it made. Yeah. But after a while, it can really be wearing on you.
It's emotionally draining.
So that when you get to the point where you can do your own thing, or where you don't care what people think anymore, because Peter David, he's one of those guys also who did what he wanted to do, not necessarily just because he was able to, but he probably would have tried to get that stuff out there anyway. And who knows, he might have even fought to get it out there, and was smart enough that he could have argued his way around things. Sometimes you can do that, sometimes you can't. But I don't know what drew you guys, any of you guys, to this particular panel, but for me, we were talking about what we would talk about, and one of the things that we both have in common is we've done monster books and we've done superhero books. And for me, those things they're very intertwined for me. Especially from a young age where I was reading like Captain America, Avengers, Thor, but then I was also reading Ghost Rider, Man-Thing, Son of Satan, and I loved all that stuff equally. And one thing that I think was a through line for me with all that stuff was how fantastic it can be, but also relatable. The Son of Satan is still a good guy. What's that all about? And it actually helped me out because I had night terrors as a kid and I was scared of the dark. I couldn't watch scary movies. So if the monsters were friendly, that actually helped me out as a kid.
And look at the Hulk. How he went being, his book was a monster book.
I love the Hulk because deep down, as scary as he was kind. He could be kind and he could be, but if you messed with him, look out. And of course, as a kid, he was chased home by bullies sometimes when I was in grade school. That also was helpful. Who doesn't want to have that ability to sort of just turn around and go,
in terms of storytelling, a lot of it is, between monsters and superheroes too, is in how it's executed. Did anyone see I think it wasn't Roger Corman, who did it? Stan Winston did a Spider-Man kind of take. Back in 2005, there was this made-for-TV movie where a guy gets bitten by a radioactive spider and slowly starts mutating in really horrific ways. It is terrifying. And it's okay, yeah, that's a real different kind of Spider-Man.
Yeah.
That was
For sure. I remember when they did that with Peter Parker at one point in the books. He had 6 arms, and it was that was freaky.
That one freaked me out. The one after the Morbius fight in the 70s when he had the extra arms. That one
we don't need extra arms.
No, that
Spider-Man.
freaked me out.
No.
I have a thing. I'm terrified of butterflies, actually.
Oh, really?
I am absolutely horrified of butterflies.
New topic.
Yeah, we're going to go into
Terror of butterflies.
You're all here as my therapists. I thought you knew. Thank you.
Terror of butterflies.
But so I'm working on a book now where I realized that the source of this character's power had to basically be represented as this cosmic butterfly. And I wrote, Eric is drawing this one, my friend Eric Jones.
The great artist, Eric Jones.
I wrote and said, you're going to laugh at me, but this has to be a space butterfly. It has to. It's the only thing that makes sense. And I'm going to hate every minute of it. I'm not going to want to look at the art. My phobia is deep on this.
Yeah.
But
That's wild.
It's what's right for the book. And it is, to me, this monstrous thing.
Yeah.
But how we present it is
So
not.
Mothra must have been terrifying for
Mothra is
you.
horrifying.
Did you not watch that as a kid? Did you hide?
A lot of that.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
And he's not even a butterfly.
No.
Whatever he is. She.
Caterpillars, moths, and butterflies. They're all equally
Wow.
monstrous to me. Mothra's what?
Oh, what?
A they them.
They them?
They them.
Oh, are they them?
Oh, they them. Okay, they them. That makes
Oh, interesting.
sense. Good to know.
Is that a new thing, or is that just always been like that? Did they just announce that recently? Oh, okay. Oh, I thought you were giving me the skinny. Well, there is a whole, there is a contingency of that, and who knows? Maybe Bandai had made a Toho. Who owns Toho? Not Bandai. Makes
Yeah,
toys.
that's Toho. Yep.
Yeah, Toho might. Who knows?
It would be so yes, they're horrifying monsters. Did anyone watch Peacemaker?
Yeah, I've seen.
I don't want to spoil anything, but I'm just say I
George
tweeted
Clooney
at,
Nukes movie?
For those who've seen it, one, I want to say the Charlton. No, this is based on the Charlton comics from the '60s. That DC bought.
Okay. You mean? Are you talking about the Suicide Squad?
Yeah, the character.
Oh yeah, I haven't seen
he
that
has
yet.
his own
Yeah.
show now.
Yeah,
He's
yeah.
John Cena
Right.
as Peacemaker.
John Cena.
I was
show.
really into
Yeah.
those Charlton action heroes
Okay.
in the '70s.
Uh-huh.
The reprints of Blue Beetle, Question, Captain Atom, Peacemaker. So seeing one of these characters finally get his own show was just, for me, that's that's huge. Well, there's something with butterflies. Why did they do this to me? It's not okay. I waited my whole life for this, and it's
Oh
I'm
my
going,
God. Oh my
am-
God.
Watch it if you want to see and think about me, and shed one tear for me, please.
I can't even think if I have a phobia that's strong, because
Oh, it's a
I
bad
got
one.
some, but I mean, Jerusalem crickets. You guys know what those are? Potato bugs. Those things get me.
Those are horrifying.
Ugh, they are
Okay.
horrifying.
Okay.
Disgusting.
So any other questions? Because we just spun off that one question
Yeah.
for a ways, but
Yeah,
does
that's
anyone
true.
wanna-
I didn't know there was a question. I forgot there was a question.
Asked it before, but how has the industry changed with the computerization versus the early 90s where you got Wacom tablets, webcomics?
Totally. It's
It's
totally
gonna be more-
changed.
Changed more for art than writing.
Well, I remember when I was first doing, not when I was first doing painted comics, but I was doing a book called Nocturnals, which is my creator-owned book that I started doing in '93. Started working on it in '93, and I had an attorney who had started in the last couple of years at that point negotiating my contracts. He was kind of a new idea that comic book creators could have legal representation, and he was my entertainment attorney basically, and he was telling me how you could do a server, and then you could scan the work, and then you could upload. I go, what are you talking about? Just like gibberish. I mean, this is 1993 or 4 or something. He's
Wow.
talking about putting my stuff up online, and I just couldn't even fathom. I just
feeling
thought
of,
that was I thought he was messing with me.
Remember SideQuest discs, those big storage? Like there
Yeah.
were publishers, you had to send everything on a SideQuest disk.
Yeah.
As this giant, I don't know,
Thick.
like 100 megabyte at most.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Was it similar to
it would
a
hold
zip disk?
JPEG file.
What's that?
Was it similar to a zip disk?
It was like a predecessor to the zip
Oh,
disk.
okay. Okay.
Like
So-
much larger and more useless.
So I just basically, my first 10 years of comics and going even forward into that was paint it. Before I had a scanner, I was just sending the pages off. And the pages were big because you worked on their paper. So you'd work on these big pages. And then you'd put them in a FedEx box and you'd make sure it was sturdy. So the FedEx box would usually be flat. And then you'd kind of, you would secure it because the pages were too big to fit in an 11 by 17 box. And for me, anyway, for what I was doing. And then they would send them off. And then they would drum scan them at the printer, which is they tape them to this drum and it scans it like that. And you might not see your original artwork for like 6 months or more. And then I got a scanner in the mid-90s so I could scan my work. And my first scanner was a piece of crap, obviously. And so you'd have to sit there and fiddle with it in Photoshop. And that was all new. No one showed me how to do photo. I had very little
learned
training
it
in
all along the
Photoshop.
way.
I still people go, there's a shortcut key for that. I go, oh, really? I don't have to. I don't even know.
The
But
way
I still work but I still work traditionally. I actually use art tools. I don't, and then I'll scan stuff in and then I'll work on it in Photoshop. But for the longest time, I was sending stuff out and not having worked on it in Photoshop, and it just got printed as as it scanned. And sometimes the scans were horrible, and you couldn't do anything about it. So it's totally changed.
Yeah, and you wouldn't even be able to look at a proof in a lot of
No.
cases.
No.
Because everything had to move physically. What changed for me with computers was suddenly I'm always available. It used to be I could just not answer the phone.
Yeah.
Now you
Phone
can't.
calls were a big deal. I worked nights, I worked nights then. So like I'd get called from New York at noon, right? And it's like 9 a.m. there or something.
Yeah.
And they need to talk to me. So actually, no, I probably would get called at like 1 or 2, and I'd still be asleep because I'd work all night, especially when you're on a deadline. And the deadline becomes your whole becomes your whole thing. So you're working overnight on a deadline, and you might not get to bed until after you've packed it up and sent it off. You walked it, you drove it to FedEx, you filled out the air bill, you sent it off. You came home and then you wind down and fall asleep, and by then it's like 9 in the morning or something. So then they would call you at like 2 p.m. and you're like, hi, and they go, did I wake you up? And I go, no, not at all. I always act like, like when Carl would call me, I always act like I was fully awake, and he always knew I wasn't. But that was tough. And then with email, I stopped being on the phone hardly at all.
Yeah.
People
I
don't
miss
even
the
pick
phone
up the
calls.
phone
I
anymore.
love the phone calls. I like the human connection because I work alone.
Oh, I can't.
all the
My
time.
problem with that is it becomes a 3-hour call.
Yeah. I like
Especially if you haven't talked to someone. Well, yeah, but
I'm
you don't get any
chatty.
work done.
I don't shut up, but
That's another reason I work at night, because no one calls you.
The other thing is, do you remember the DC Comics as an example? Christmas to New Year's, offices and publishing are empty.
Yeah,
They
that's pretty
work.
much entertainment.
Right, it
yeah.
all shuts down. But now we're all online. They're
Yeah.
still sending you like, hey, what about
Yeah.
that script? By the way,
Yeah.
it's December 24th. I need it on the 27th.
There's no
I'm like,
buffer
are you
anymore.
kidding me?
I have Dark Horse editors that will write me on a Saturday or a Sunday, and if I write them on a Saturday, because they're working from home now, they'll write me back. They don't even know any better. They don't know that they should ignore me until Monday. They just write me back on a Sunday night or like a Saturday night. It's like, okay.
Yeah, they don't. Like,
'Cause that's
we
how my
both
brain works
We've
anyway.
worked for home for decades. All these people who are new to it are messing it up. Like,
Yeah,
oh,
I know.
no,
they're
it's
growing
my
up with this
weekend.
technology, and we remember like when phones used to ring, like, or when they would, you dial a number
Oh
and it would
my
go
God.
all the way back around.
Trying to push that dial to go
Or
faster.
when you could call popcorn. You guys remember popcorn? Okay, it's so off topic.
So writing for different companies, what are the differences? What do you use?
Well, I mean, say different companies sometimes have just different guidelines or different expectations on formatting, but by and large, I wouldn't say there's much of a difference with any of the companies I've worked for. It's because there isn't really a standardized. Mostly, there isn't a standardized like do it our way. They just want you to do a thing that they can look at and it works. And they don't expect every writer to change the way they write for the company so much. It's more like if you're suddenly writing a novel versus a comic book and the industry's changed. But from within comics, I've never really noticed any real dramatic difference in.
Sometimes it
expectations.
depends on. Okay, here's a for instance. If like when I did Thrill Killer at Chaikin for DC, so it's a Batgirl and Robin and Batman Elseworld story. I had an idea for it, which I sent to Archie. It was like what you call a one pager. So it's basically just the rudiments of the story, who's in it, what it's about, real quick. No more than 2 pages. So I sent that to Archie, and Archie read it and he liked it. And then he said, I said, I think Howard should write it. I think because Howard's older than me, and he was around in the '60s when, I wasn't around until '65. But he has that feel in his work, and so he pitched it to Howard, and then Howard wrote an outline, which was what we call a breakdown of page by page breakdown. So this happens on this page, this happens on this page, this happens on this page. Then you can go into this happens in this panel, this happens in this panel, and then you can go even further and put in the dialogue, okay? And that's when you're basically going full script. So there's various stages of an outline.
I hate outlines.
To be honest, I like having a page by page breakdown because I have more control over the storytelling. And then when I'm done with the pages and the story, then the writer picks it up and then he writes the dialogue to fit what's going on. And as long as I have followed his script or the agreed to story, it shouldn't be that tough. Sometimes, though, you have a full script where everything is being said and every panel is very clear, and you have to make sure you make room for it. See, I don't work that way when I work for myself because things are constantly evolving. I'll go to bed, I'll finish a page and go to bed, and then I'll wake up, or before I fall asleep, I have an idea for something, and I go, oh, shoot. Not only do I have to change that, I have to do another page of art to fit into the story. It's like when you, like a filmmaker who shoots a scene and goes, oh, Reed, I need another scene before this scene to make that scene make sense. I want to show this happen so that this makes sense to the reader or the
nice
viewer.
thing about working for yourself, too, when you're working for yourself, you can do that.
Yeah.
I mean, with one book,
It's harder to do when you're working with a collaborative team.
Yeah.
It's very difficult.
Or you have to have people who are very patient with you.
Or a good editor who points it out to you.
I added a 28-page issue in the middle of this. I called up Justin Greenwood. He's down there. You should say hi to him.
Yeah, I know.
I called him up. I'm like, okay, I know we're going to do X amount of pages with this X amount of issues, but I'm like, think about this. It doesn't have to change anything you've already done, but we can put it right here. And he saw it. And a lot of the people I work with, we generally, at the start, we have a discussion. And Eric and I both have this one shorthand, which is, if I can't justify it, then it's a no. Like, if I have something I want to change that's a big deal, if I can't convince him why it makes sense, then it doesn't make sense. He has to be able to hear what I'm saying and look and go, yeah, I can see why that would be the best thing we should do. Because if I'm asking him to do extra labor, he has to be able to look at it, or whoever I'm working with, has to be able to look at it and go, that is for the best thing for the book, and I can totally see why.
Yeah.
And of course, it still
serves
has
the
to work
story.
logistically, time-wise, but
Yeah.
everything
That's
you
a
do
pretty
has
big
to
deal.
serve the story.
28 pages?
Oh, yeah, it
Yeah.
is. It is. I've done that on 2 books. But in both cases, I looked and said, wow, think what we could do with this and what the difference it makes. In both cases, it was Eric and Justin on different books. They both looked and said, you're totally right. That's something we should do. I was lucky. I worked with people who were very patient with me. Because when you work with people, especially you work as a writer, as somebody who only writes, because I don't draw, you have to defer to the artist. They are the ones in the trenches. They have to execute the time-consuming, laborious part of, you get to go, and then they all dance. Okay, now you've got to draw.
My thing used to always say to Jeff Parker was, who's also a writer-artist, to say, a writer writes the word, interior, library. And it's like, I got to draw that.
Yeah.
But the thing
equal.
is and then you have to commit to it. You go, okay, I'm going to do a library. I'm not going to do just a bunch of lines. I'm going to draw, what does it look like? Is it, what do the bookshelves look like? Are there statues? What's the architecture? And, and you have to throw yourself into it, because if you don't, you're in the wrong business. But you can also write something that's very, very complex, and an artist can learn how to, over time, encapsulate it very simply. So you could say library and go, oh, I gotta do a whole library. Or I could have a close-up of a stack of books on a table. You know, that's a very rudimentary thing to do. But there's definitely ways to make it simple and get across the idea instantly and effectively without having to sit there and draw something. And also,
sometimes
it's
less
kind of
is more.
boring after a while sometimes.
Sometimes less is more. Sometimes you need
Yeah.
that, like a very
Well, if you can get
minimal approach.
intimate with your story rather than trying to blow people's minds with that crazy library, because there's different reasons for it. You know, if it's really important to show the immensity of a library, it's like that scene at the end of Raiders, where the immensity of the warehouse.
Yeah.
That's important,
You
you know.
need that
If they just showed it being shoved into a slot,
It would mean nothing.
and they never pulled back to show how big it was, it would not have had the same impact. But if it's not important how big this warehouse is, you could just have, you know, a shelf with a couple of boxes on it, because that's not important. That's incidental to the scene. So it all depends, you know. So you gotta balance it out.
Yeah, so I was just wondering, have you guys ever done any adaptations of older comics and trying to figure out how to modernize, even if it's as simple
That was
as,
one of my first jobs.
as simple as just updating the language. You know, I remember I came across an old Avengers comic from like the early 70s, and there was a phrase, I think it was like shooting, I think it was.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Which back
It's
then
like the
just
Joker
situation.
situation.
Maybe some hard truths or something like that.
Well, it's like my dad would say, "You really pulled the that time."
Yeah.
Yeah,
You
there's-
go,
there's
"What
there's
did
that
you just
Batman
say,
comic, The Joker.
John Crickfalusi had George Licker would say that. "You really pulled the that time." And like his dad must have said that to him too.
I did back to my Supergirl Cosmic Adventures book. There was elements of that because I did a lot of things that called back to her first appearances, and I adapted some of those scenes into the book. But I did definitely give them modern energy. But I didn't want to ignore them. I didn't want to erase them. I thought they're fun bits, and I like the connectivity we can have in comics. Where
What
we
in
don't.
Sam Hill are you talking about?
Oh, adapting.
What in blazes are you talking about?
Great stuff.
I love that stuff.
So what was your first one? Then?
Roy
What was-
Thomas, 1969. You know.
What was this one you did?
So I did. First thing was with Kurt Busiek, but that's when we were like, no one even knew who Kurt was. They definitely didn't know who I was. But the second thing I did was, after I had kind of done an unimpressive job with Eclipse Comics, they're not around anymore, but they were a California-based company, and they gave me my first, you know, penciling job, and they were, quote, mildly impressed with my results. So I went back to art school because I was in art school at the time, and I started working on this painted version of a thing called the Black Terror, and the Black Terror was a 40s superhero character, and he was in the public domain, and there were a couple people who were at Eclipse who wanted to do something with the character. So I did this kind of 7-page thing. It was for a school project, actually. But in my mind, I was thinking maybe this could be an audition for this revamp of this character. So they wanted to take the old Black Terror character and kind of make him like the Punisher and the Wise Guy, which is a TV show where a guy who's a cop goes undercover as a mobster. It's called Wise Guy. It's before Goodfellas. Okay. And so I started working on this storyline. It had nothing to do with what they wanted to do. It was just the Black Terror fighting vampires or something, because it was fun to draw. And then we got actually, when I showed them the work, and they said, "Oh, we want to do this with him now," and they hired me to work on it. So then I was working on their script, and it was like working on some new character, because they just took the name and the fact that he had a skull and crossbones and a mask, and that was pretty much it. There wasn't really much, because everything that was from that comic in that time was just so dated and silly. It was for kids. They were trying to do this updated Punisher-like war journal type of, you know, wise guys thing, which was cool. It was fun to do, you know. And to be honest, taking something that's kind of 1940s, you know, and putting it into like a more contemporary vein is fun to do, because you have that visual sort of spark, and then you've got the story has something that you can sink your teeth into, other than most, you know, I try and go back. I love looking at old comics, but it's really hard for me to read them all the time, because they're not written for me. They're written for kids, or I don't know exactly all the time who they're written for, but
Well, there's usually old comics written for kids that are now no longer.
what I do find is I read like Roy Thomas writing the Avengers in like the late 60s. This stuff is a riot, because this stuff is just so fun, you know.
Yeah.
The way people talked back then, and the way that Marvel editors, or writers, I should say, would interpolate the reality of the 60s and 70s and put it into a comic, and then they would like, it was like a heightened stylized version of what was going on. And especially like that's why I'm really into this is so out in the left field, but the romance comics that Marvel used to do. Marvel used to have these romance comics that were drawn by the same people that are drawing their top superhero books: John Buscema, John Romita, Gene Colan, Don Heck, and even Steranko. I mean, you could think of like the biggest comic book artists of the 60s or 70s for Marvel. They were drawing love story comics too, and they're amazing.
Yeah.
I get so into them now. I don't care about the stories. It's just looking at the way they were drawing the 60s and 70s is just kind of mind-blowing.
Oh, it's fascinating.
My Love, Our Love, Love Story.
All of those.
There's actually reprints that would reprint some of this stuff that like trade paperbacks that you can get, and I think it's called My Love or Marvel Romance Comics or something like that. But some of the splashes, like kids in a soda shop and all the different hairdos, like John Buscema would go to town. He would draw these crazy fashions and hairdos, you know, and the guys wrote the sideburns, but they just looked so great. It looked like you wanted to just jump right in there. It's not how I remember the 70s being. This is not how I remember
I
it.
remember the 70s being kind of depressing and everything was brown.
Everything was too, orange and green and just,
There's not-
But
it's not
no, this is
okay.
all Marvel colors, so.
Yeah.
So they're pretty interesting. It's funny when you try and collect them, they're kind of expensive when you find, and they were reprinted from the time there were 12 centers to 15 centers to 20 centers to 25 centers. They kept rehashing this stuff.
Just put them back out.
Yeah, and I never remember, because I had one or two friends when I was a kid who I was collecting comics with, and they never ever once said, hey, you got to check out these romance comics. John Romita's in here, this guy's in here. And we would have just went, no, it's for girls. But that stuff is amazing. Yeah.
How do you guys deal with creative burnout?
Oh, I've been building a retaining wall in my backyard. that'll like eventually you go, nope, I want to get back to writing. You just invest yourself in new things. Watch new shows, read new books, read new comic books, talk to different people. You have to, without input, there's no good output. And if you limit your input to the same things, even the same types of things, you don't have any diversity of creativity to play with.
Have you guys ever noticed how there were certain trends in comics and mainstream comics where kind of the same things were happening a lot? Like I remember in the 90s, everything was a computer virus that was infiltrating the system. And I got so tired of it after a while. I was like, what is with these guys? Enough with it.
That will save or destroy the world.
It just like all of a sudden it was like, really everything is this. And it's so boring. And I feel like, maybe you could step away from your computer and stop dealing with your computer issues for 5 seconds.
Right.
And go,
This is my reality. Let's
go
talk
walk
about
through
it.
a field or something. That's a good question.
And one that takes a lot of time, but the short version is persevere and network. Meet people.
Yeah.
Ask them what they're doing. Ask them advice. And there are times where it's very difficult. One of the most important things that ended up working for me is understanding I needed to work well with people. If I can make people want to work with me, if I can make their experience fun and they like working with me, I'm more likely to get work in the future. Yeah. If I'm difficult, argumentative, I've got my creative vision.
That was me when I first started. I was a prima donna. But you want to become an asset. You want to be an asset.
Yeah.
But what you're talking about is like one thing I found was when I wanted to do comics and stuff, and I was kind of like, I was in school, art school, and there were a couple of kids I knew who liked comics, but no one was as serious. There were a few people who were serious about it as I was. I was like really focused. And it wasn't until I met people who actually did it for a living and kind of fell in love with this kind of idea of being in that community that I started to connect with some of these people. But at the same time, I was still doing artwork and I had ideas and I was drawing stuff. So I was showing people my stuff. I was listening to what they had to say, and then just coming to conventions and getting to know each people, over time, is a form of networking, and you'll pick things up, Sometimes it's like, well, I have this thing I did, would you mind looking at my work? Yeah, sure, I'll look at your work, Most people, creative people are open to that, unless they're super busy or something. So that's a helpful thing, but don't give up. Don't do it for you.
Yes.
And do it because you love it and because you can't really see yourself not doing it,
Yeah.
And then align yourself with other people who feel the same way. I have friends who aren't really mainstream
comic book creators that have been doing comics for years. They just self-publish their stuff, and they go to shows like this, and they go to all the shows, and they push their and promote their work, and they get it out there. And no, most people wouldn't know who they are, but I have a lot of love for them because they're more dedicated to what they're doing than a lot of the freelancers that I know, or people I know who are really good artists that are just like, you know, they don't even, like, they're sort of like halfway committed, you know, and it's kind of sad.
Find your voice, find your project, find your audience for that voice. That is a thing. Like, don't try to change who you are to meet what you think the audience will want, but create the thing that's important to you so you stay joyful in it, and then search for the audience for that. Because there's an audience for everything. I think we're out of time. And I wish I could address that question more because I think it's an important.
That's really a whole other panel.
You know,
We'll do that in half an hour.
Well,